This episode of Segaiden is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of, wait, what?
Yeah, scrumptious.
Crunchy stars, great taste from Post, and the Swedish chef.
Wonder Boy, Opa Opa, Alex Kidd. Depending on who you ask, one of these characters represents the Sega Master System as its mascot, a little fellow who showed up in a bunch of games, had a memorable likeness, and helped sell the system. Heck, if you're European or Brazilian, you ended up with enough Sonic the Hedgehog games that he might qualify as the Master System mascot in your book. Well, you're all wrong. The Sega Master System's actual mascot was Sylvester Stallone, a little fellow who showed up in a bunch of games, had a memorable likeness, and helped sell the system. Consider, early on in the system's life, we had Rambo First Blood Part 2, the first Master System title to feature a photograph on the box art rather than a piece of royalty-free clip art. Soon after that, we saw Rocky, a game that didn't just sport a photo of Stallone on the box, but also boasted the best graphics that had ever appeared to that point on an 8-bit console. And now we have the biggest, beefiest, and above all, greasiest of Stallone appearances with Rambo III. That's 3 appearances, which put him ahead of Alex Kidd and Wonder Boy's Tom Tom to this point, and gives him equal footing with Opa Opa, if you don't count Opa Opa's little cameos in games like Zillion. Stallone was the Master System's guy, especially when you wanted a samizdat take on a popular arcade license that Sega didn't feel like paying the publishing fees for. And hey, fair enough. Why pay SNK for the rights to Akari Warriors when you can have your team whip up We Have Akari Warriors at home and use the savings to pay for Stallone's likeness rights on the box and title screen? In keeping with that principle, Rambo III is Taito's Operation Wolf, if Operation Wolf were set in Afghanistan rather than South America. That's because Rambo III takes its narrative cues, such as they are, from the film of the same name. Having already shot up the state of Washington in a fit of justified PTSD before gunning down most of the Soviet forces stationed in Vietnam in order to save some American POWs, John Rambo ventures into Afghanistan to take part in America's proxy war there against the Soviet Union. Co-written by Stallone, Rambo III barely managed to squeeze into theaters in time for its setting to have any relevance. The Soviet Union would withdraw from Afghanistan about 9 months after the film's release, and just a couple of months after this game's release. The USSR was well on its way to breaking up and putting an end to communist rule of that entire bloc, and Russia had begun to wind down its imperialistic ambitions, at least for a few decades anyway. Rambo III sees its eponymous character also putting an end to his warmongering ways, taking up a monastic life in Thailand with a bunch of Buddhists. That is, until his old pal Colonel Trotman gets captured by the Soviets and chucked into a prison camp. Really, Rambo III is a study in the futility of good intentions. Just as Rambo seeks to put an end to killing here, but ends up racking up perhaps the biggest one-man body count in movie history to this point, Trotman ends up in a gulag for trying to run guns to Afghani freedom fighters, who would later use that training to become the Taliban. Though, just to be clear about those urban legends, the original cut of the movie did not actually dedicate itself to the Mujahideen. I'd argue that Rambo III represents the apex of Stallone's Hollywood career in terms of visibility and clout. It's a movie that he co-wrote and starred in, appearing prominently in full vascular definition on all marketing materials, and which Wikipedia claims was the most expensive film ever produced to that point in history, though it netted less at the box office than First Blood Part 2, which could explain why Stallone's subsequent career, while not exactly a dud, never matched his peak Rambo and Rocky period of the late 80s. Anyway, Sega licensed Rambo III for adaptations on both Master System and Genesis. Since we're still in December 1988 at this point in the chronology, and the American Genesis doesn't actually exist yet, all we have to work with, at this point, is the 8-bit interpretation of the film. Unlike Sega's previous Stallone titles, Rambo and Rocky, you don't see a lot of Stallone during this game. That's because it takes the form of an Operation Wolf clone, a light gun shooter played from a first-person perspective where you shoot a bunch of guys and bats for some reason, as the screen scrolls slowly to the right and your life bar slowly drains because it's impossible not to be hit by enemy return fire. As for why Rambo III plays like this, well, one could say it was Sega wanting to utilize their light phaser accessory for another major release while capitalizing on the popularity of a recent arcade hit that had yet to make its way to home systems. But personally, my theory is that Sega didn't want to include Rambo as an in-game sprite because they knew the Master System's 8-bit hardware lacked sufficient power to render the specular sheen of John Rambo's perpetual coating of grease that he wears throughout the film. Seriously, he's lubed up like Joe Don Baker in every scene. Like, I get that the man wanted to show off his best-in-class muscle definition, but his perpetual slime coating in Rambo 3 stands in stark contrast to everyone else's perfectly dry skin and starts to make you wonder if John Rambo suffers from some sort of underlying health condition. Anyway, Rambo 3 for Master System is a short game, consisting of 7 stages that can be played from start to finish in less than 10 minutes. In theory, anyway. This is of course a Sega-made 8-bit action game, so good luck actually surviving long enough to make it to the final stage, and it's actually kinda cool vehicular combat mode. Rambo 3 does not play fair, hitting you with unavoidable attacks by enemies that can soak up damage, and offering only a single health refilling power-up to recharge Rambo's life bar at your discretion per stage. Come to think of it, I guess Rambo 3 also marked the decline of Stallone's career as the Master System mascot, not just as a Hollywood mascot. Despite selling the superb Power Strike exclusively through mail order, it looks like Sega of America didn't hate compile-developed shooters after all. But then again, R-Type was a bit of a corporate coup for Sega, a Nintendo-published game appearing exclusively for home play on Master System in the US. Well, sort of. R-Type is a weird localization blip in America, having appeared in arcades with the Nintendo logo on the marquee, yet not appearing on a Nintendo system until Super R-Type for Super NES in 1991. My guess is that their distribution of the R-Type arcade machine results from that little kerfluffle Nintendo and developer Irem had back in 1985 over Kung Fu. Since Nintendo poached Kung Fu from its own creators in order to make it a first-party Famicom and NES release, they ended up offering a few make-goods to Irem. The red LED lights on Irem Famicom carts was the most visible of these apologies, but I would not be surprised to learn that part of that also involved Nintendo selling R-Type cabinets in 1987 through its established US coin-op distribution chain. The fact that Nintendo had not released a dedicated standalone coin-op cabinet since 1985's arm wrestling, having fully switched over to the interchangeable Versus and PlayChoice systems, and would never distribute another standalone arcade cabinet again, is part of what makes for such an odd blip. The other part is that despite shipping the coin-op edition here in the States, Nintendo did not publish or license the game for release on its console. Instead, anyone who wanted to play this creepy, challenging, Giger-esque shooter at home had to look to Sega's console, or eventually the TurboGrafx 16. I guess that's not entirely Nintendo's fault, since Irem didn't bother releasing R-Type for Famicom in Japan either. Honestly, it seems like they could barely make the game work on PC Engine. The game's Japanese release on that platform broke it into 2 parts and shipped them as separate products, called R-Type 1 and R-Type 2, not to be mistaken for the actual R-Type 2. Meanwhile, Sega commissioned Compile to bring R-Type to Master System, and the developer did its usual bang-up job. Unlike the PC Engine release, this R-Type contains the entire game on a single cartridge, and then some. Compile added an all-new bonus stage as a grace note. To be fair, the Master System port can afford to run on a single ROM because it's a much less detailed version than the one on TurboGrafx 16 and PC Engine, meaning that it requires less data space than the luscious Turbo Edition. And that's significant because a big part of R-Type's impact in arcades resulted from its extraordinary level of visual detail. Irem drenched the game in biomechanical visual flair, sending players through more than half a dozen stages of richly textured environments that combined elaborate technological structures with creepy biohorror elements and monsters. Even simple architectural elements boasted a detailed, intricate appearance, with wall panels that shimmered with detailed crystalline elements set into rounded bevels. R-Type looked simply amazing. The game wisely stuck its most memorable bosses in the first 2 stages, since making it past Stage 2 is a difficult task for a normal human being. Krell, the first stage boss, appears to be a legally distinct version of the Xenomorph from Alien, shackled to a massive machine, while the second boss, Gomanda, is a bizarre alien worm that grotesquely slimes its way through the valves of what appears to be a giant human heart with a distinctly yonic quality to it. The Master System port of the game does a spectacular job of recreating the overall style and look of R-Type, including every stage from the coin-op and then some, with only modest cuts or revisions to layouts and enemy placement. However, it greatly cuts back on the actual visual detail of the graphics, stripping down the sculptural shading and scaling sprites to a much smaller size. So it's a trade-off. R-Type for Master System contains the full game on a single cartridge and doesn't need to scroll vertically to fit the screen resolution, whereas R-Type for PC Engine captured the arcade game's detail almost perfectly, but shipped in Japan on 2 separate full-price HuCards and suffered boosted difficulty resulting from the addition of screen scrolling. Though the US TurboGrafx 16 release did manage to crunch the entire game into a single card, to appease cheapskate Americans. I guess all of this is nitpicking because R-Type didn't appear at all on NES, which is a shame for NES kids because they missed out on the single coolest shooter of the late 1980s, vying, I suppose, with Darius for the honor. But you could realistically create a fairly arcade-accurate home port of R-Type, something that simply would have been impossible for Taito to accomplish with Darius, thanks to that game's triple-screen, ultra-wide setup. Although Japanese arcade-goers preferred vertical shooters over horizontal, you have to imagine that R-Type might have changed a few minds. Certainly it did well enough to kick off a cottage industry of games inspired by it, such as the infamous Zero Wing. Fundamentally, R-Type plays quite a bit like Konami's Gradius, all the way down to the checkpoint-based continue system that boots you back to a fixed point in each level whenever you die. Here, as there, you continue without any upgrades or added powers, meaning that the simple act of surviving long enough to make it back to the point where you died in the first place can be a near impossible task. And as in Gradius, your ship moves around pretty slowly as it faces attacks from carefully organized formations of enemy fighters, ground-based emplacements, and random strays who pop up to catch you off guard. Where vertical shooters take advantage of their large playing fields to create acrobatic tests of reflex, R-Type sticks to the Gradius model of weaponizing the cramped screen confines and measured pace of the action against you. However, it drops Gradius's trademark element of customizable upgrades. R-Type doesn't even give you a power-up scheme as complex as Power Strike's 8 upgradable icon-based options. Instead, you simply collect icons that drop from friendly mecha, which appear around the battlefield. These give you access to a fixed, limited feature set, for example, allowing you to fire missiles to supplement your main weapon, or different forms of laser attacks based on the color of icon you collect. Your fighter ship, the RX-9, not to be mistaken for an RX-7, has a few key innate abilities. You can fire a charged shot rather than a simple energy blast by holding down the fire button, allowing you to unleash a variable stream of high-force plasma energy. And more crucially, you can command the bit. The bit is R-Type's key trademark game element, one that defines it nearly as much as the slick visuals. The bit adds a lot of complexity to a seemingly simple shooter, but it also provides you with immense flexibility. At its most basic level, the bit works like a shield power-up in Gradius, and absorbs incoming projectiles or blocks enemy craft. Unlike the Vic Viper's shield though, the RX-9's bit doesn't wear out after a few hits. It's effectively indestructible, meaning you can use it as a sort of battering ram if you like. Mostly, it means that you need to make maximum use of it, memorizing a stage's layout and enemy setup so that you can deploy it in a way that will fully exploit its protection. This becomes especially clear in Stage 3, a totally unconventional level that consists of you slowly working your way around an enemy battleship, dismantling it piece by piece, and dealing with attacks from fixed sources in inconvenient directions. The thing about the bit, you see, is that it doesn't have to sit at the nose of your fighter to function independently, and when you reclaim the bit, you can attach it to different points on the RX-9. In effect, it becomes a shield for that side of the fighter, protecting you against attacks that come from a given direction. Well, most attacks. As you discover in the battleship assault, the bit still can't keep you safe from overwhelming force, so you need to be mindful of massive particle beams and other deadly threats. The bit makes for an interesting game addition, and its near constant presence, once you find the correct power-up, gave Irem the confidence to make R-Type a ball-breakingly hard take on the shooter. R-Type requires twitch skill, yes, but also patience and a knack for memorization and strategic planning. The Master System version does an impressive job of conveying all of this despite the console's technical limitations compared to the arcade hardware. I mean, that's kind of the Master System's whole thing, right? Punching way above its weight class and its enthusiasm to recreate arcade experiences. And I have to say that it can mimic a game like R-Type far more effectively than it can, say, a game like Galaxy Force, as we'll see tragically before too long. But that's a sad story for another day. Here at the end of 1988, the Master System has R-Type, and a pretty convincing take on it too. The 16-bit consoles, or 8-bit consoles masquerading as 16-bitters, are still more than half a year away. Between this port, Double Dragon, Golvelius, Power Strike, and Phantasy Star, it's hard to imagine anyone who owned a Master System feeling disappointed with their lot as the year began to wind down. And half of those games came about because of Compile, I notice. So, thanks Compile. Thumpile. Sega knew it had something special, or at least very cool on its hands with R-Type, featuring the game on the cover of the 5th issue of Sega Challenge. The game shared a feature spread with Rambo III, as it happens, with screenshots that spanned all the way to the third stage. Yeah, I'm pretty sure even Sega's folks can't clear R-Type on a single credit. Rambo 3 got a smaller write-up with helpful tips like shoot the bad guys as they appear. Honestly, Sega Challenge is so slight and useless that it feels like a forerunner to modern political journalism.